Hi, everyone. My name is Liz Marston. I'm the museum director at the Elgin History Museum. Today is our brown bag lunch talk, and we're featuring Elgin Railroad history. Andy Thompson is a volunteer at the museum. He's been a docent for, gosh, the last 4 or 5 years. Right, Andy?
Correct.
And he also does our statistics and helps us in many different ways. But he also is interested in transportation, works in transportation, and has spent a lot of time researching the history of railroads, particularly in this area. So that's something that I know we've always wanted to, wait, he's screen sharing already. That's something we've always wanted to talk about, because it's kind of confusing. There's all these different railroads and different types of power. Uh-oh, and he went back. All right, so Andy, we're gonna get started here, and I think everybody is muted. If you're not, we'll mute you, and then at the end we'll take some questions, and then you unmute yourself, I think, or we can unmute you too. So, any questions now before we start? Nope. Okay. All right, Andy, take it away. Screen share.
All right. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for this presentation on the history of Elgin railroads. Elgin railroads go back 170 years, so there's a lot to cover. This is just an overview of it. There's a lot of detailed history that can be obtained through further research through books and etc. This first slide here is a picture of the westbound Midwest Hiawatha crossing the Fox River Bridge, probably in about the 1940s. This came out of the museum collection. Give me a minute here to get the PowerPoint moving. And all right. All right, the program overview. The first part will cover the different railroads that have served Elgin. The Galena and Chicago Union, which is the first railroad to serve Elgin, also the first railroad to serve Chicago. So very important railroad in Illinois history, our regional history. The Fox River Valley, which is the railroad that ran from Elgin up towards Lake Geneva. Whoops, sorry about that, folks. Let me go back here. All right. Bear with me, I'm not a pro at PowerPoint, which this is the presentation that it's on. Chicago and Pacific later became the Milwaukee Road, the various interurbans that also serve the Elgin area. And here is the depots and station section. The Northwestern had 3 stations in town. The Milwaukee Road had 2, and then later on Metro added the Big Timber station out west. The interurban had a couple different stations in town, and then also we'll touch on Spalding, which was actually a separate town, which has become part of the far southeast edge of Elgin at this point. All right, then we're going to go through some travel aspects of living in Elgin and travel, look at some of the early years, some of the train schedules and so forth. The end of the 19th century, skip ahead to the 20s, start covering some of the commuter services that developed sometime probably around the 1920s. Then the 50s and 60s, which was kind of a golden era for Elgin travel, because at that point you could travel actually out to the West Coast right from Elgin before the onset of Amtrak. 1970s was when it was back to just a regional commuter town. All right, is Elgin a railroad town? It's a good question. As far as dealing with some of the other outer ring cities like Aurora and Joliet, there's more of a railroad presence in those towns. Many people are probably familiar with the Roundhouse down in Elgin, or down in Aurora, I stand corrected. And also Joliet has some major crossings of some of the main railroads that serve the Western United States. But Elgin has a lot of history as far as the early development of the railroads and so forth. All right, the start. The Galena was the first railroad that ran, as said before. You have to bear with me a second here, everybody. I have to figure out how to time this, stop the timer. Give me one moment and I will be right back with you. Okay. Galena was really one of the most important places in Illinois back in the era when in the 1830s and 1840s with the lead mining. It was a port to the Mississippi. It was more important even than Chicago at that point. The first two railroads that served Illinois, or the second and third railroad actually, their goal was to get to Galena because of the importance of the lead mining and the mining in Galena. Here's an early picture of Chicago, and obviously Chicago was up and coming with the building of the Illinois and Michigan Canal, and also the start of the railroads, the first of which was the Galena and Chicago Union, which is the railroad that came out through Elgin. Here's a map, early map of the route between Chicago and Galena. 183 miles, Chicago's about a quarter of the way out from Chicago. And some of the early people involved in the Galena and Chicago Union had ties to Elgin. So that's one of the key points of why Elgin wound up having the first railroad come through on the way to Galena. Railroad actually first started on paper, which is very common at that time back in 1836. Kind of never developed beyond a paper railroad. Finally, in 1846 is when they started to build the physical railroad. They used what is known as strap rail track, which the picture here shows. It's basically a piece of strap metal on a piece of wood. Not very good design overall. Found an article where actually one of these pieces of rail would come up and coil and wound up going into one of the cars shortly after the railroad started operating. Fortunately, didn't take anybody out, but came very close according to the article that I found on it. Chicago finally has a railroad in 1848. Here's the original depot, essentially down by the Merchandise Mart area there. And the 1850, on January 22nd of 1850, Elgin finally had its railroad. This is not a picture of the railroad coming to Elgin. Obviously, this is a much later picture when they were showing the pioneers, a historic relic. A lot of this was probably the 1948, 1949 on the centennial of this event, 1950 in this. At this point, it was a short but significant railroad. It was running about 43 miles. This is the line that comes up through South Elgin, coming up from West Chicago, to give you a picture of where the line came. It wound up coming right into downtown Elgin. It's kind of interesting because most towns were either built before the railroad and the railroad went around the town, essentially the main part of town, or was built after the railroad and the town is kind of centered around the railroad. Well, the Galena and Chicago Union kind of decided to just build right through the middle of town. Elgin was founded around 1830, so this was a well-developed area when it was built, and that's why even today, if most probably remember when the trains used to come through downtown Elgin, they ran right between the buildings and so forth. It was decided by June of 1851 that they wanted to move on, as in the name of the railroad. The intent was to get out to Galena. At some point, the engineers decided to cross the Fox River south of town, where both the railroads cross now, leaving the east side just as kind of a spur. Here's a ad of the train running out to Marengo. A lot of ads would show Chicago and Galena Railroad as actually the Galena and Chicago Union. Poor reporting or something of that nature at the time. They built towards Galena, and they wound up in Freeport, and they stopped. And why did they stop in Freeport? Well, by that time, the Illinois Central, which was building from Cairo up to Galena, had already built towards Galena, and the decision was made by the Galena and Chicago Union to just stop in Freeport. At that point, the traffic would be handed over to the Illinois Central to go to Galena. And what wound up happening is the Galena and Chicago Union started building another line from what is now West Chicago towards Iowa, and that became essentially their main line. The Fox River Valley Railroad. The Fox River Valley was a railroad that started here in Elgin. It took the spur that was on the east side of Elgin and started building towards Wisconsin. Its intent was to build and connect with the railroad called the Milwaukee and Mississippi, which was part of what became the Milwaukee Road at a later point. The railroad wound up just going up to the Lake Geneva, Williams Bay area. This is some certificates or shares, actually, as you can see, that are in the museum collection, the actual shares. It took a little while for the railroad to get going. Got on paper in the early 1850s, and in 1855 it had reached the Crystal Lake area. Here's another Chicago Tribune from 1855 that I resourced on it. And the line extended up to Wisconsin, and it went to Lake Geneva. This part of the line here was never really developed. That was the intent, to have that line go up to Waukesha, as had been mentioned in an earlier slide. But running from Elgin here through Crystal Lake, Richmond, and out to Lake Geneva, or at that time it was just called Geneva with Lake Geneva next to it. Things weren't so good. The boom and bust cycles of that era, as we'll see through multiple times in the displays, the slides, they went bankrupt. They renamed it the Elgin and State Line Railroad, one of several railroads that actually had Elgin in its name. Here's another stock certificate the museum has. Unfortunately, they don't have much value, so. Contract to operate. In 1860, the Elgin and State Line entered a contract with the Galena and Chicago Union, making them essentially a paper railroad, and the equipment being merged into the Galena and Chicago Union fleet. Just by coincidence, these two gentlemen who made this agreement happened to go out to Promontory, Utah, and make the same agreement when the Transcontinental Railroad met. The Chicago Northwestern comes to Elgin. Chicago Northwestern didn't build any tracks into Elgin, but in June of 1864, they merged with the Galena and Chicago Union, and at that point, the town of Elgin became an exclusively a Chicago and Northwestern town. Second railroad to come to Elgin was the Chicago and Pacific Railroad. The Chicago and Atlantic was chartered in 1865. The name was changed to Chicago and Pacific in 1872. And in 1873, the monopoly of the Chicago Northwestern ended in Elgin, and the Chicago and Pacific arrived coming in from the Bartlett area. This is now what's the Metro Milwaukee West Line. It paralleled the Chicago Northwestern on the west side, and then ran the Fox River through town, and then left town where the big timber station is at this point. They wound up building to Byron. If you look at this map, it shows all the way out to Savannah, but the lines that come out of here must indicate that they were actually under being built at that time. This would have been, this is an 1876 timetable I got these images from, which we'll look at a little later in the presentation with a little bit more detail. Again, things didn't go so well for the CMP. In 1880, they were leased to the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railway, which many will recognize that is the precursor to the Milwaukee Road, or the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific. Milwaukee Road versus the Northwestern. Eventually, with the Milwaukee Road being the main line through town and the Northwestern being the branch lines, the shift to the prominent railroad through Elgin in terms of transportation became the Milwaukee Road. The interurbans between 1895 and 1957, Elgin was served by several electrical interurbans, to include the Elgin and Belvedere and the Chicago, Aurora, and Elgin. The first interurban to serve Elgin was a railroad, or interurban, called the Carpentersville, Elgin, and Aurora Railroad. And here we'll kind of show where it came into town. It came on Duncan Avenue, or Duncan Road. When the railroad eventually was taken out of service, the road replaced it at a later point. I'm not going to cover the streetcars of Elgin other than to show where they ran based on some of the interurban lines and so forth. But as you can see, it came Congdon, Prospect, and then down through Douglas. There was also a second line up Dundee that kind of formed a loop. And then a little bit later, we'll go over where the terminal was in downtown Elgin for the interurbans. The name changed multiple times during its history. The It was eventually merged with the Chicago Aurora and Elgin, or the Aurora, Elgin, and Chicago at some point, and we'll kind of touch a little bit on those different moves a little later with some of the timetables and stuff we're going to take a look at. A couple interesting things I find is that Pace still has bus routes, at least as far as last I was aware, that follow basically the services that were provided by these interurbans through the Fox River Valley. You can see by the map they ran from the Carpentersville, Dundee area all the way down through Yorkville at one point. All right, the Aurora, Elgin, and Chicago started in 1903 and 22. They changed the name to the more known Chicago Aurora and Elgin. Interesting late fact about the railroad: on July 3rd in 1957, I believe by a court order, they shut down in the middle of the day under bankruptcy, leaving people stranded, primarily downtown working. People in Elgin obviously could probably catch the Milwaukee Road out that day, but people who were in the little towns and stops along the way that didn't have the luxury of having two railroads serving their town were basically stuck in downtown Chicago, or actually out by Forest Park and Des Plaines. But anyways, they stopped in the middle of the day. Here's some great pictures. I want to just thank a gentleman named Mark Lanuza. He is actually a photographer, a Metro employer, their official photographer. He grew up here in Elgin. He had lots of great pictures to share, so I just want to throw a thank you out. This picture on the left is obviously behind Grove Street, and you can see the I'm not good with names of places or people, Spies in the background there. And then the picture on the right is down off of Raymond Street, which is an area where there's a lot of railroad crossings and activity, which we'll show a little bit of later. There's by Watch Factory. The Chicago Aurora Elgin did have some freight work. Those are freight locomotives there. There's a nice picture of the Watch Factory from the National Street Bridge. Here's a picture of them again down by where their depot was at downtown there. I believe that would be Riverside Drive now. The Elgin and Belvedere served between here and Belvedere, eventually going out to Freeport. And an interesting fact about that, about 5 miles of their line out in the Union area is where, if you ever go to the Illinois Railroad Museum, you are traveling on their former right-of-way. Here's a couple pictures. You can see how it came into town off of Wing Street down Edison, and then Larkin to Highland into downtown. The one customer road, the Aurora, Elgin, and Fox River Electric, which ended service in the 30s, but freight service continued until wired service continued 1947, and then it was dieselized. They had one customer. It was the state hospital. And in the early 70s, they switched to natural gas for their power plant or their heating plant, and the railroad, without a customer, closed down. This railroad actually has a section that the Fox Valley Trolley Museum utilizes. If you ever take it, that's their right-of-way. That locomotive you will see again in a later picture. It is orange, so to kind of help out when you see it in little head. Here they are serving their one customer. Elgin also had several gravel pit railroads. Some of these I think were the same gravel pit areas, but different names of the companies, and some of them were different companies for different areas around Elgin here. Reed's was north of town. It was actually west of the river, and I just recently found out some research. There was another railroad bridge that went from the Chicago Northwestern East Line, the line that ran up to Lake Geneva, and crossed and helped serve Reed's. Chicago Gravel. Here's to give away the clue. Here's your locomotive that was on, or engine that was on the other line we were just speaking of, serving Elgin and Bluff Gravel, Elgin Gravel. Some of these are back behind the Bluff City Cemetery down in that area along 25. All right, railroads up to 1950, just a quick review. We talked about the Galena Chicago Union, the first railroad, the Fox River Valley and the Elgin and State Line, which are the east line up to towards Lake Geneva, became the Chicago Northwestern. 1873, Chicago Pacific came. Then in 1880, the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul took over, and then it eventually became the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific. The interurbans of Carpentersville, Carpentersville, Elgin and Aurora, the Elgin and Aurora, and a bunch of other railroads that served as interurbans from around the turn of the century up into the 1950s, and the gravel railroads, which I didn't go through here. All right, Depot Town. Elgin has had about 10 depots based on my research. I believe it's probably more than any other city's amount of depots. Joliet may have had somewhere in the same neighborhood, but we'll just take the honor and run with it till they kick us off the throne. All right, the first depot or stop, we can't find evidence of an actual physical depot being built, was at 7 South Spring Street. The belief is that perhaps at the hotel that was across the street, people could have utilized that as their waiting area and ticket purchasing. It was only there maybe 2 to 5 years. I put 2 to 3, but that's probably a little short. And then that station moved in sometime during the late 1850s to a little up the block at Douglas Street, which is essentially by the city hall near across from the police department where it is currently today. This is believed to be an image of the lower depot. It's kind of obscured by the other building. I believe the building behind it is the freight depot, according to some information and research. So this was probably an early picture of it. In 1886, the original depot burnt down and they replaced it with a brick depot costing $25,000. This is a picture looking northwest. That's Douglas Street in the foreground there. And behind the depot is the East Side Railroad yards. Here's a 1910 photo of the East Side Depot. You can see at the bottom there, there's streetcars, the Douglas streetcar tracks running down there. Here's another picture of the depot from across the street on Douglas Street. Here's a little bit later, you can tell by the cars and such. This is looking southeast at the depot. Douglas would be the first crossing right there. To the right is probably towards the end of its life, looking essentially northeast. East Elgin, the end of the line. Passenger service ended in about 1932. At one point, the depot had actually become a used car lot, and it was raised in 1950. Here's a Courier News photo of it being taken down in 1950. Kind of a sad day. Looked like a nice, well-built building. All right, the Galena and Chicago Union, the first depot, possibly the second station, was up on Crystal Street, up on the hill there. There's a picture from an early panoramic view of Elgin. In 1869, a brick depot replaced the original depot. Here's an early photo of the brick depot. West Elgin it was referred to. East Elgin was the one on Douglas. West Elgin was the one up on Crystal. Here's an eastbound train departing. And you can see the Cook book factory manufacturer smokestack in the background there to kind of give you, that's also gone, but give you an idea where that was or is. Here's a picture of westbound arriving into West Elgin. And the West Elgin end of the line in 1971, West Elgin Depot was raised, and that's kind of in its last days. There is a depot in West Chicago. It's no longer a depot, but the building is right off of Washington, west of Main, if anybody's familiar with West Chicago. And that depot is very similar in look to what was in Elgin here. That is still standing. And here's a picture of what it looks like now from a couple of weeks ago when I was roaming around doing some research. The Watch Factory Depot down here, built around 1883. It last was in the city directory as a depot from research until about 1915. Here's a picture of the depot when it was in active service. After it had closed, it had many lives. It looks like here was some type of shop. It became a TV repair shop at some point in the 60s, and then it sat empty for a long time. There's a wig-wag old style signal there. This is it during its kind of period between being used and being restored. Here it is in a restored picture, 2004. All right, we're going to go over to across the river and go to the Chicago and Pacific Depot. This is the original depot that served Elgin. This is now the main depot in Elgin to this day, not this building, but this location, 109 West Chicago Avenue. Here's some early pictures. This is milk containers. As many know, Elgin was a hub for dairy, and that shows the dairy waiting to either be picked up or have been dropped off by another train ready to go back to the wherever the Thick Farms, I guess, was where it would be at. This picture is a commuter train, probably 1940s by the pictures, and ready to go down into Chicago, much pre the bi-levels that later served the route. Here's a little bit newer picture. In 1947, the original depot that we were just looking at was replaced with this modern depot, which still serves. For those who aren't familiar, this is a phone booth right there, if that helps identify it. And there's a commuter train waiting on the siding there. Let me zoom ahead, but that's all right. Here's another picture of the Milwaukee Road freight locomotives coming through town. And then a picture probably from the 80s with the RTA already having taken over some aspects of service. As mentioned, hub of railroad activity, the new commuter, the bi-level commuter cars being utilized, the platform with the roof on the platform. There's a picture of a crew cleaning out the snow, keeping things running for the railroad. This is, I believe, 79. All right, the Milwaukee Road National Street Depot. There's 3 depots that served the watch factory or National Street. This is the second one we're going to touch on. That's depot on National Street, the original depot. You can see the tower building in the background there. In 1960, early 60s, the original depot was torn down, and that's another sad day. And then it was rebuilt. For many years, it was just basically a shelter from the early 60s, 1962, now the year comes back to me, until 2004, it was just a little shelter. 2004, they built the nice new depot. It's not staffed, but it is a lot better than what was there from the 60s through the 2004 period. And the newest station built by Metra is Big Timber. Out on the west end of town, serving the Randall Road, near a railroad place called Elmora. And then going to the other direction, to the east, you had Spalding, which is about 3 miles east of Elgin, and is under a railroad called the Elgin Joliet and Eastern, another railroad named after Elgin, although it really didn't serve Elgin until 1962, this is their depot there. I thought this was a classic picture. A gentleman named Gaelic photographed a lot and came into possession of a lot of photos and donated them to the museum. I believe most of these railroad pictures from the early 50s were by a gentleman named Dale Buffkin. They're credited to him, but I thought this was just classic. This is the westbound Midwest Hiawatha, probably about in its last year of service or around the last year of service, coming west through Spalding. Where they are hanging the line is now a Metra repair facility or maintenance away facility. If people have been through Spalding or are familiar with the Spalding area, that road there is Spalding Road heading towards the east into Bartlett. But just a great picture with the water tower and the train in the background and the person doing, the lady hanging the laundry. More pictures of Spalding, westbound Milwaukee Road freight train coming through Spalding, and the southbound Elgin, Joliet, and Eastern train coming through Spalding. This is in the 70s. The depot burned down, I believe, in the mid-70s. It has not been replaced. There had been talk at some point of maybe putting another stop in there, but I don't think it's ever developed beyond any talk. It's been a while since I've heard or read anything about it. The interurban station was a little bit different. It was actually storefronts in downtown Elgin. The Chicago Roar and Elgin came in on what is, I believe now, Riverside, along the river there, and people could board out basically the back door of the storefront. This is when it was on Douglas Street, about 1908, as the top of the photo shows. That was the back of the depot at 16 South Grove. You see the Chicago Roar and Elgin sign. In 1930, it moved up to State Street, and we'll show that here in the next slide. 3 Chicago, as you can see, there's the sign for the Chicago Roar and Elgin is right there. And obviously you had the hobby store next door that somebody mentioned recently, and the some different businesses right along State. This is a parking lot now, so it's long gone. The Chicago Roar and Elgin also had a National Street stop, and as you can see, there's the platform and the nice shot of the side of the watch factory with, I think that's kind of neat there with the Elgin watches. Going to go with 1940s by the picture. Here's a postcard on the left of early days of the railroad at the interurban from the National Street Bridge. And here is the shelter building and a train pulling in, heading into Elgin, I believe. All right, a review of the stations. Chicago Street and Spring, the original depot when the railroad first came. The West Elgin depot was actually, we believe, built when the railroad started heading to Galena. East Elgin off of Douglas Street. Chicago and Pacific, Chicago on Chicago Street there. Watch Factory had a depot, Chicago Northwestern Depot, and then National Street had the Milwaukee Road and the Chicago Roar and Elgin, Spalding, the interurbans, and the Big Timber. So that's the depots that have served Elgin. It's going to go a little bit behind the scenes. Railroads keep running because a lot of people do a lot of work behind the scenes. Things happen that make it magically work, and here's a picture of gentleman changing the light bulb or lighting the light bulb for a freight train or probably a passenger commuter train in Elgin. Somebody with more knowledge would know if that locomotive is probably most likely served as the commuter fleet. Interlocking towers are where 2 railroads meet. It's basically like a stop and go light, very generically. Elgin had 2 in the area. One was at a location called B35, which is also known on the Chicago Northwestern as Forest. And it's down off of Raymond Street, down on the southeast kind of edge of town, or south, just east of the river off of Raymond Street. The second location was a location called Spalding Tower. That tower is now at the Illinois Railroad Museum out in Union. So that still survives, not in location. Tower B35 is long gone. Inside those towers, behind the scenes in the sausage factory, this is what is called an Armstrong tower, and the gentleman there would pull levers to make switches change and signals change. They were interlocked, so you couldn't have both lines having green at the same time, creating a potential accident. That's where the term comes from. The street crossings, this is not a picture from Elgin, but it was a good crossing picture. There's a gentleman named 40s taking pictures of railroads, and particularly people who work for railroads, which kind of adds a great dimension to it. If you ever have access to look at the pictures, they're neat pictures. The crossing towers are basically the people would come out with the signs or set manual crossing mechanisms. There was one at Douglas Street across the street from the Douglas Railroad Depot, or the east side, lower Northwestern Depot. One up at Ann and Grove. There was a crossing shanty, which I kind of zoomed in on a picture, is, as you can see, the lady who worked that crossing for many years looks like she's probably flagging the crossing at that point. And then on the west side, right between Chicago and Highland, you can see there was a crossing tower over there for a long period of time. Water towers. Water towers were also a key part of railroad operations. There were several of them in the Elgin area. Here's another picture of the ones out in Spalding. Here's an eastbound freight going through, and the laundry still hanging to dry. On the east side, there was a water tower up off of Grove and McBride. Put the back of the photo on here. A lot of information is, if you take pictures, I always know what the pictures are. I've learned that on the personal side, so that's always beneficial. The west side double header coming in eastbound. I think I skipped a slide. No, I guess not. Okay, another eastbound coming into Elgin. I think we used that picture before. The unique thing about the east side the west side water towers that had a concrete base, which still survives. You can see it on State Street as you're going up and down the hill, and you cross the what is now the Union Pacific tracks, but at that point, the Chicago Northwestern. All right, travel. We'll go through the travel and quickly try to go through this. I know we had a few glitches. We try to keep it about 45 minutes, but we'll have a few more minutes of going through travel. I don't believe this is in Elgin. It is in the Elgin collection, but I don't believe it is. Somebody with more knowledge would probably have to pipe in and let me know. Here's an early schedule published in a newspaper, and that the 1850 trains coming in from Chicago to Elgin, basically a couple a day. Two lines were coming through Elgin, one train on the west line, or one train on the west line and a mixed train on the east line, which is a train that also had freight service combined with it. 1855 service to McHenry began, eventually going up to the the Lake Geneva, Williams Bay area. They used to put the train schedules in the newspaper, which is helpful. 1860, the Glen and Chicago Union, predates it, 1860, but it was just kind of showed their map and routing in an advertisement. Chicago and Pacific. This was the oldest timetable I could find in the museum's collection. It's from 1876, just a few years after they had started operating. There's the map that we saw earlier. Basically, you had three trains out to Elgin and one train going out to Byron at that point. I want to say the schedule was about an hour and a half, and they were 6 miles closer than the Chicago Northwestern routing, and they took advantage of every 6 miles, 6 or 7 miles. I think it was in a slide possibly earlier. 1880, railroads used to publish what was known as the Traveler's Guide. Every railroad in the United States was in there. You could figure out how to get anywhere, primarily utilized by railroad agents and so forth. They had expanded further west by this point, 1886. They had service all the way out to Omaha and Kansas City. Chicago Northwestern, 1892, as you can see, between Chicago and Elgin. This is what is known as a employee timetable, which shows both the passenger and freight train schedules. Quite a bit of activity coming in and out of Elgin on the Chicago Northwestern at that point. This is the Fox River line, the one up to Williams Bay, as you can see at the bottom there. Even quite a bit of activity. Eventually what happened is most of the passenger traffic started coming off of the line that runs between Palatine, Barrington, and comes cut up north to serve McHenry. The section between Crystal Lake and McHenry still is in service by Metra. The rest of it's been abandoned from here in Elgin all the way up to Williams Bay, other than that little short section. Here's a card that shows the different options for trains in and out of Elgin between here and Chicago on both railroads. Obviously still competing for business in town here. Some old tickets. Clintonville is South Elgin, as many will probably know. And the Aurora, Elgin, in Chicago. This was the interurban line. Here's the schedule that at this point, both the train between Chicago and Elgin and the ones that ran in the Fox Valley were under the same railroad. So this is all the trains that served between Elgin and Carpentersville. As you can see, they have pretty frequent service at that point. The Fox River trains ran from Aurora to Elgin. You would have to take a different train down to Yorkville. Quite a bit of service at this point. The fares, you can see from Chicago to, it's a little hard to read, but it looks like a round trip was $1.10. 1909, the hourly salary was 22 cents per hour, just to give an example. A little bit later timetable of the interurban, the Chicago, Aurora, and Elgin timetable from 1939. Quite a bit of service between Chicago and Aurora, or correction, Elgin and Aurora, and a branch service to Batavia. Here's a close-up of the train coming into Elgin. A lot of this is now Bike Pass, Prairie Path, and Clintonville, Renwick, Cullenburn. Not familiar with it. Obviously, National Street is recognizable, and Elgin, which we've looked at many pictures of the Elgin coming in, the train coming in on the interurban on the backside in Elgin there. 1927, commuter service had developed to a point on the Milwaukee Road where there was actually timetables. And you can see that one of the most unique things I found out about doing the research is that they actually show Kirkland as the end of the service line. Not sure what was going on with Kirkland, why it wasn't Davis Junction to serve Rockford better. I'm not sure. Somebody with more knowledge can follow up. You can see there were trains serving all the way from Kirkland down to Chicago, with Elgin still the primary town. The arrow on the Southwest Limited were the through trains that were utilized for people traveling out to Kansas City and Omaha and places like that. Westbound coming out of Chicago, same situation. Multiple trains going out to the Kirkland area. Here's a picture again of that commuter train getting ready to board to go into Chicago. Here's one approaching National Street. The coach yards are between Chicago Avenue and National Street, where they service and park the passenger trains, the commuter trains for their next assignment. Passenger service ends in East Elgin in 1932, and the freight service continued until the so let me rephrase this. Passenger service between Crystal Lake and the Lake Geneva area continued in the 1970s, which I kind of mentioned a little earlier. West Side passenger service ended in the early 1950s. I believe it was 52. Trains number 703 and 706 served Elgin out to Freeport. This is not the locomotive in Elgin, but from my research, this was the locomotive that I believe served the route during the end of years of operation. Milwaukee Road intercity passenger service. This is from the late 1940s. 3 trains served Elgin, long distance trains served Elgin at that point. The Southwest Limited to Kansas City, the Arrow, which served the Sioux City, Sioux Falls area and Omaha, and the Midwest Hiawatha was the premier train. Most people know Hiawatha. It was the premier train of the Milwaukee Road. The Chicago Northwestern had the 400s, but they didn't serve Elgin. The newest and latest from 1948. One of these is still in service if you're ever interested. It's based out of Minneapolis. I rode it from here, from actually Minneapolis back to Chicago last fall. It's really a neat thing to do. Here's the westbound Hiawatha pulling into Elgin. Big day for Elgin and the railroad's passenger service. In 1955, the Union Pacific switched from the Northwestern there going Geneva to the Milwaukee Road. And here are there what are known as city trains, City of Los Angeles, City of Portland, and so forth, started coming through Elgin. And at that point, you could ride from here out to the West Coast on the premier Union Pacific trains of the 1950s. That's another shot of the National Street Depot. The other shot was zoomed in. This is obviously showing the train coming through here. 1962, the Milwaukee Road. You can see they're highlighting the trains, the city of trains that served Elgin. Looks like 6 trains serve Elgin. It's actually 3 if you look at the times. And by the end, there was basically one train. It was called the City of Everywhere that served Elgin. Here's some of the overviews of the schedules going out west. Los Angeles. And all good things must end. Unfortunately, with the decline of intercity passenger service, Amtrak started in May of 1971, meaning the end of this particular service. They chose the service that ran on the Burlington Northern Line, which is the line that runs through Aurora towards Galesburg and across Iowa. So that was the end of the through passenger service in Elgin. These are shots that Mark shot of the last train coming through. May 2nd, 1971, the last eastbound train of the City of Everywhere. And that was the end of intercity passenger service in Elgin. Commuter service, here's the Milwaukee Road with the probably midday train with just one car. Suburban service. Fortunately, the service to Kirkland had ended by this point. This is from the early 70s. And westbound. And then just a quick glimpse of the very recent past. For the times we are in, this is the look at the District West Line, the temporary schedule under the COVID-19 pandemic, which has adversely affected the commuter service. I think I've heard or saw articles, ridership is down like 90%. If you go to the parking lots or see the parking lots here in Elgin, they're just almost empty, during the middle of the day. A little follow-up, more recent times. So Chicago Northwestern became the Union Pacific in 1995. I think most railroad fans would say this is interest, would say that's kind of a sad day. Just became a part of a big railroad. A lot of rich history was essentially, it was gone in a way. This is obviously it crossing DuPage Street when it was still servicing the east side. The Milwaukee Road had quite a history of changes. In 1980, it went bankrupt. 85, it was purchased by the Soo Line. As it says, it was almost purchased by the Northwestern, which might have ended the service through town here other than maybe the commuter service. I&M took over in 97, 2002, ICE, Iowa, Chicago, and Eastern takes over. And then in 2008, the CP Rail takes back over, which is the same railroad as the Soo Line, so it almost went full circle. This is down at B35, as it's referred to as. On the left there, you can see the Union Pacific tracks, the Elgin bypass going over, the old tracks of the Northwestern going into downtown Elgin, and an eastbound train. Commuter service, 74, the Northwest Suburban Mass Transit District was formed because the Milwaukee Road was in such financial dire straits. They needed locomotives, and they came up with this plan for them to take over. 1980, RTA takes over the service, and then in 1987, Metro takes it over and has been running it ever since. Metro really has done a good job of taking what was really a struggling service and bringing it back, obviously pre-COVID-19 situation. There's a shot the other day I took down by the depot. And that is actually the end of the show. I thank you for your patience with the technical glitches. I thank you for your patience while I go through it. I want to thank a few people before I get too far into questions and answers. A gentleman named Patrick Doran did a few books on the Chicago Northwestern, which I utilized for research and a couple pictures. A gentleman named Paul Burns, I may not be pronouncing it right, wrote a book called Steam Trains to Lake Geneva, which covers the history of the East Line up to Lake Geneva. And Mike Elf, who's very much the historian of Elgin, provided a lot of notes and details. And then everybody at the museum, particularly David, who gave information on the depots, and Beth, who helped research a lot of the photos and stuff I used.
Okay, does anybody have any questions?
Please be some questions.
I can't get. There we go. Anybody have any questions? Should I unmute you? I can unmute all. Oh. There you go. Now you're all unmuted. Anybody want to ask any questions? Have any comments?
I have a comment. I don't know if we're on the screen or not. This is Bill Jones. I have, we bought the Chicago Galena right away behind our building at 19 South Spring Street. And I've got a mural on the Pioneer locomotive on the back of the building. And a lot of people don't know about it. It was one of the first murals that Elgin allowed. And just right down there, I'll get pictures out on my Facebook. That's all I've got.
We'll need to plug it in.
So, Bill, you're saying that you guys bought the section of land behind your building?
I've got a deed from the Galena Chicago Railroad from 1850. The train ran right behind our building, and I'm thinking that it was a stop where passengers got out and then were taken by horse and buggy to the hotels. It never had a depot, but it had a platform.
Oh, never had a depot but a platform. Okay.
That's interesting you bring that up, because that was a discussion we had in the museum here. David, who has very thorough research of buildings and locations here in Elgin, his records also show that there was never a depot built there. And so confirming that is great. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, and we've got a railroad family. My grandpa ran over the Rocky Mountains from Good to Deer Lodge, and my dad worked for the Milwaukee Road for 40 years as a civil engineer going downtown Elgin and in downtown Chicago. And, so I'm a real railroad fan. We used to take the Olympia and Hiawatha out to Deer Lodge, Montana every summer for 2 weeks. That's where my mom and dad were from. They never really liked it out here in Elgin, Chicago, but that's a little bit of our family history.
Yeah, Milwaukee Road served out to the Pacific Northwest up into the early 60s, the Olympia Hiawatha. So it's Deer Lodge too. Thanks for sharing.
Right.
Anybody else have any questions or comments about the railroad history? A lot of information was covered for sure.
Dad took
Yeah.
the Los
I'd like to
Angeles
make a
commuter
comment.
from Chicago too.
Sure, go ahead.
Oh, this is Andy's parents, and we'd like to say
Hi.
very good job. Thanks
Oh,
for all
thank you.
your research.
That's
Thank
a
you.
great job.
At least I had one fan.
That's why we had you. We made sure you were there so you could say that. No, he did an excellent job. And
I do
think
have
you're-
a question.
Sure, go ahead. Who's that?
Dennis.
Oh, yeah,
Dennis?
this is Dennis. And Andrew, you mentioned that during the COVID period, the ridership is way down by 90%. Was there any talk about, is it going to recover after we get out of this pandemic? Is there hope that the ridership and the use will go back up to what it was?
Based on, that's $1 million question. I think with everybody remote working, the dynamics of office work will probably change at some level. I'm sure it will increase too at some point. I want to say, and somebody might have more knowledge or seen more reports on this, realistically returning to the 70-80%, maybe more where the long term is, and how long it'll take, I'm not sure. I don't think short term, within several years, it's going to be back up at that the pre-pandemic levels, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Hi, Dennis and Sandy.
In 1938, when my dad came to this country from Europe, he took a train from Chicago to Los Angeles. And at that time, he told me that the train was called the Los Angeles Commuter. But I have no idea if that was really true or not. But he did, in fact, take a train. He took a train from New York to Chicago and then changed trains and took a train from Chicago to Union Station in Los Angeles.
Yeah, there was the Los Angeles Limited, not a commuter, so it might have been the Los Angeles Limited. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, I
That would have
knew
made
it
more.
had LA in it, but I wasn't sure. But this was 1938.
Okay, yeah, interesting.
Well, my dad was a commuter on the Milwaukee Road in the early 60s. And I recall that Omaha train came through Elgin as a late commuter. In other words, if you had a real cush job and you didn't have to be at your desk until 9 or 9:15, you could take the Omaha train that came from overnight into Chicago because it was much better than the commuter cars. And then you could take it back in the evening. And I used to feed the ducks off the Chicago Street Bridge waiting for my dad. It was the time when if you had two cars in your family, you had a train car that all you did was drive to the train and park it there because that's all it was good for.
Interesting.
That's
Thanks.
good. Thanks, Deb.
By the way, I am dialing in from Denver. Thank you so much for this.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad you're here.
Yeah, that's
Anybody
when.
else have any comments?
Got any snow in Denver?
Yeah, we got some. It's only the northern part of the state got more. I actually live in a suburb, but we needed it badly. We've had fires, of course, in the state that the moisture has helped.
My
It's a
sister's
little
in
early.
Aurora. She's in Aurora, but she said she got some snow.
Yep, we're happy to have it. And it'll be 70 on the weekend.
Well, Andy, thank you so much for being for doing the research, for putting this all together, and for
Good
telling us
job.
all about railroad history.
Thank you, everyone. Again, thank you for your patience. This is actually my first presentation, my first Zoom presentation. So this is new territory for me. So I appreciate everybody's patience. And if you have any follow-up questions, contact the museum and I can try, or something to share to correct or whatever, by all means, reach out to the museum and I'll try to, either research it or get it corrected and such.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.